The Tower of London did not begin as a symbol of tradition or continuity, but as an instrument of shock. After the Norman Conquest, William of Normandy faced a city that was large, wealthy, and deeply hostile. London had not fallen by a single decisive battle. It had submitted reluctantly. In this climate, the construction of a massive stone fortress was not a defensive necessity alone, but a political statement. Rising above timber houses and Roman ruins, the early tower announced that England now belonged to a new ruling class. Its very presence imposed authority before any law or decree could. The White Tower stood at the heart of this message. Unlike earlier Anglo-Saxon fortifications, it was built of stone on a scale previously unfamiliar to most of England. Imported Caen stone from Normandy reinforced the sense that this power came from across the Channel. Thick walls, narrow windows, and an elevated entrance made it clear that this was not a communal refuge, but a structure designed to dominate both landscape and population. The tower was visible proof that Norman rule was permanent, not provisional. Royal authority was embedded into the building's function as much as its form. The White Tower was not only a military stronghold, it housed royal apartments, administrative spaces, and a chapel dedicated to St. John. This blending of fortress, palace, and sacred space reflected how Norman kings understood power. Rule was exercised through force, ceremony, and divine sanction at once. To enter the tower was to move through layers of authority, each reinforcing the next. As London expanded, the tower remained a fixed point of control. New curtain walls, moats, and towers were added over generations, but the White Tower remained the core, both physically and symbolically. Each monarch adapted the complex to new threats and needs, yet none abandoned its original role. Even when the city grew wealthy and politically influential, the tower reminded its inhabitants that ultimate power still rested with the crown. The use of the tower as a prison further deepened its association with the royal dominance. Those confined within its walls were not common criminals, but political threats, rebellious nobles, rival claimants, religious dissenters. Imprisonment here was not about invisibility, but about display. Confinement in the tower carried a message understood across the realm. Defiance of royal authority would be contained, observed, and remembered. Ceremony also played a crucial role in shaping the tower's meaning. Royal processions passed through its gates before coronations. Weapons, regalia, and symbols of sovereignty were stored within its secure chambers. The tower was woven into the ritual life of the monarchy, linking conquest-era power with later traditions. What began as an imposition gradually became normalized as the physical anchor of kingship. Over time, fear and familiarity coexisted within its walls. For Londoners, the tower was both protector and threat, a guardian against invasion and a reminder of surveillance. Its massive silhouette dominated the eastern approach to the city, reinforcing a psychological boundary as much as a military one. The White Tower did not need to speak, its permanence did the work. Even as military technology evolved and the tower's defensive value declined, its symbolic authority endured. The structure outlasted dynasties, religious upheaval, and civil war, retaining its association with the crown long after its original strategic purpose faded. The White Tower remained what it had always been, a monument to conquest solidified into stone and to royal power made unavoidably visible. The Tower of London earned its reputation as a prison not because of how many people passed through its gates, but because of who they were. Confinement here was reserved for those whose status made their fall meaningful. Kings, queens, high nobles, church leaders, and political rivals were brought inside not to disappear quietly, but to be seen as defeated. Imprisonment in the Tower transformed political conflict into public spectacle, even when the walls hid the prisoners from view. Royal blood did not protect against confinement. Edward V and his brother, the princes in the Tower, vanished within these walls under circumstances that haunted the English crown for generations. Henry VI, once an anointed king, was held and died here after civil war stripped him of power. Their presence turned the Tower into a place where legitimacy itself could be suspended, questioned, and erased. The prison functioned as a reminder that kingship depended on control, not sanctity. For nobles, imprisonment in the Tower carried a particular weight. These were men and women accustomed to authority, land, and command, now reduced to captives under royal watch. Some lived in relative comfort, housed in chambers rather than cells, allowed servants, books, and correspondence. Others were confined under harsher conditions as their political value declined. Or the Tower reflected hierarchy even in captivity, reinforcing the idea that status lingered even as freedom vanished. Religious conflict added another layer to the Tower's role as a prison. During the Reformation, bishops, abbots, and theologians were held here for refusing to bend to royal supremacy. Later, under Mary Stuart and Elizabeth I, Catholic and Protestant prisoners alternated roles as traitors, depending on who held the throne. The Tower thus became a place where faith itself was criminalized, and belief was treated as a threat to state authority. Execution and imprisonment were closely linked in the Tower's identity. For some prisoners, confinement was temporary, a pause before death on Tower Hill or the nearby scaffold. Others were released after years of uncertainty, their loyalty broken or their usefulness restored. This unpredictability intensified fear. Prisoners never knew whether the Tower represented survival, humiliation, or the final chapter of their lives. Interrogation and confession formed another invisible function of the prison. While popular imagination exaggerates torture, pressure was real and constant. Isolation, uncertainty, and proximity to power worked as psychological tools. Prisoners were questioned not only to extract information, but to force acknowledgement of royal authority. A signed confession or public submission mattered as much as punishment itself. The Tower's reputation spread far beyond London. To be sent to the Tower became shorthand for disgrace and danger throughout England. Chroniclers, diplomats, and foreign visitors understood its meaning immediately. The prison did not need mass incarceration to instill fear. Its symbolic value was enough. A single high-profile prisoner could reinforce obedience across the realm. Over centuries, the Tower accumulated stories rather than numbers. Scratched names on stone walls, coats of arms carved in cells, and recorded final letters turned the prison into a repository of memory. Each generation added new figures, new accusations, and new betrayals. The Tower remained a place where power confronted resistance face to face, and where survival depended not on innocence, but on politics. Executions associated with the Tower of London were rarely chaotic acts of violence. They were controlled, deliberate, and deeply political. Death behind or beside the Tower was not simply punishment, it was communication. Each execution sent a message to the court, the city, and the wider kingdom about loyalty, obedience, and the limits of dissent. The Tower functioned as a stage where power eliminated threats, while carefully shaping how that elimination was remembered. Court intrigue often determined who would walk from the tower to the scaffold. Accusations of treason were frequently rooted in factional rivalry rather than clear acts of rebellion. Anne Boleyn's execution followed months of shifting alliances, whispered accusations, and legal manipulation. Others met similar ends as political winds changed, not because they challenged the crown openly, but because they stood too close to it. The Tower absorbed the consequences of ambition, becoming the place where proximity to power turned lethal. The location of executions reflected status as much as guilt. Common traitors were often taken to Tower Hill, visible to crowds and public judgment. High-ranking prisoners, especially women of royal blood, were executed within the tower's walls, shielded from mass spectators. This separation preserved dignity while reinforcing hierarchy even in death. Privacy was not mercy. It was a controlled extension of royal authority over the narrative of execution. Bloodshed within the tower intensified its psychological weight. Prisoners could hear preparations, bells, and movements that signalled another life about to end. Even those who were spared lived with constant uncertainty. The tower did not rely on frequent executions to maintain fear. The possibility alone was enough. Silence, delay, and rumour became tools as effective as the axe. In stark contrast to its role as a place of death, the tower also guarded the crown jewels, the most potent symbols of monarchy. These objects represented continuity, legitimacy, and divine sanction. Regalia, such as crowns, sceptres, and orbs, were not decorative treasures, but instruments of rule, used in coronations to transform a ruler into a sovereign. Their presence within the tower linked violence and authority to ritual and permanence. The security surrounding the crown jewels reflected their political importance. After periods of civil war and upheaval, especially following the English Civil War, the jewels were redesigned and carefully guarded. Their survival mattered as much as their material value. To protect them was to protect the idea of monarchy itself. The tower became the physical vault of legitimacy, holding symbols that could outlast any single ruler. The coexistence of execution grounds and royal treasure within the same fortress was not accidental. The tower embodied the full spectrum of royal power, the ability to destroy and the right to rule. Bloodshed reinforced the crown's dominance, while the jewels projected stability and continuity. Together, they told a single story, that authority was maintained through fear, ceremony, and control of memory. Visitors, diplomats, and courtiers understood this dual meaning instinctively. Passing through gates that had seen prisoners walk toward death, then standing before glittering symbols of kingship, made power tangible. The tower did not separate cruelty from splendour, it bound them together. Its walls held both silence and spectacle, reminding all who entered that the monarchy endured by mastering both. Fear was never an accidental byproduct of power. It was a deliberate instrument. In medieval and early modern England, authority did not rely solely on written law or inherited loyalty. It was reinforced through visible consequences, carefully staged punishments, and spaces designed to intimidate. The state learned early that obedience could be cultivated more efficiently through uncertainty than through constant force. Fear filled the gaps where law could not reach. Architecture played a central role in this strategy. Massive walls, narrow gates, and looming towers were not merely defensive features, but psychological ones. Structures like the Tower of London communicated dominance before a single soldier moved. Their permanence suggested inevitability, and their scale reminded the population of their own vulnerability. The state embedded fear into the landscape, making authority feel inescapable and omnipresent. Public punishment transformed individual bodies into political messages. Executions, imprisonments, and displays of confiscated property were choreographed events meant to be witnessed and remembered. The goal was not only to eliminate dissenters, but to shape collective memory. By watching the punishment of others, communities learned the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Fear became a shared experience, quietly reinforcing compliance. Uncertainty was one of the most effective tools of control. The state did not always act quickly or predictably. Delayed trials, prolonged imprisonment, and ambiguous accusations kept both elites and commoners off balance. No one could be entirely certain where loyalty ended and danger began. This ambiguity discouraged resistance more effectively than constant repression because it forced individuals to police themselves. Elite fear mattered as much as popular fear. Nobles, officials, and courtiers lived under constant awareness that favour could shift without warning. Proximity to power brought privilege, but also exposure. By allowing high-status figures to fall publicly, the state demonstrated that no rank guaranteed safety. This maintained discipline within the ruling class itself, preventing collective opposition from forming. Religion and ideology further reinforced fear-based authority. Challenges to royal supremacy were framed not only as political threats, but as moral and spiritual crimes. By criminalizing belief, the state extended its reach into conscience itself. Obedience became more than a legal obligation. It was presented as a moral necessity, blending fear of punishment with fear of divine judgment. Control through fear did not require constant violence. The mere possibility of punishment shaped behaviour long before force was applied. Rumours, reputations, and remembered examples did much of the work. Over time, fear became internalized, transforming external coercion into self-regulation. Authority appeared stable not because resistance was impossible, but because it seemed unthinkable. The endurance of state power depended on managing this balance carefully. Excessive terror risked rebellion, while leniency risked disorder. By alternating severity with restraint, the state preserved its legitimacy while maintaining control. Fear was not the foundation of authority alone, but it was the framework that allowed laws, institutions, and traditions to function without constant resistance. Plots against the English crown rarely began with armies. More often they started as letters, written in careful code, whispered promises carried through taverns, or meetings staged to look accidental. The state treated conspiracy as a kind of invisible warfare, and the Tower of London became one of its most important instruments for fighting it. When a suspected traitor passed through the gates, the message was immediate. The crown had a place where secrets could be contained, and where stories could be broken apart until they matched the version the government needed. Political prisoners were not held simply to punish them, but to control what they could still influence. A rebel leader in chains could still inspire followers. A priest could still move communities. A noble could still attract allies. The Tower isolated such figures from networks of loyalty and rumour. It also turned them into symbols. A prisoner's name circulating through London could frighten some and encourage others, and the authorities understood that controlling access to that prisoner meant controlling the pace and direction of public emotion. Espionage fed on the same pathways as trade and diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors, merchants, translators, and sailors carried information as naturally as they carried goods. In times of crisis, that everyday movement became a threat. The Crown's intelligence networks relied on informers, intercepted correspondence, and forced testimony. Inside the tower, investigations could move from suspicion to accusation, with frightening speed, not always because evidence was strong, but because fear demanded certainty. The prison became a laboratory of state security, where the line between protecting the realm and protecting a regime could blur. Conspiracy trials often depended on narrative more than proof. A plot had to be told in a coherent shape. Who recruited whom? What was promised? What signal would begin the rising? What foreign power might assist? Prisoners were pressured to supply that structure, sometimes by offering names, sometimes by rewriting their own actions into a confession. The tower's value lay in its ability to keep a suspect suspended in uncertainty, cut off from allies, unsure of the Crown's intentions, aware that silence might be interpreted as guilt and speech might condemn friends. That psychological vice was often more decisive than any physical hardship. The yeoman warders stood at the boundary between these hidden dramas and the outside world. They were not faceless soldiers, but carefully chosen guardians whose presence itself projected legitimacy. Traditionally drawn from experienced military service, they represented discipline, loyalty, and continuity. Their role was practical, guarding prisoners, securing gates, controlling movement, but it was also performative. When a yeoman warder appeared, the state appeared with him. In a place built on secrets, they became the visible proof that order still held. Daily routine inside the fortress depended on such control. Keys, doors, patrols, and schedules were not minor details. They were the architecture of authority in motion. A prisoner's privileges, light, visitors, paper, a servant, a book, could be granted or withdrawn in ways that shaped behaviour. The yeoman warders enforced these boundaries, acting as intermediaries between power and the individual. Their knowledge mattered. They learned which prisoners were dangerous, which were broken, which were bargaining for time. Over years, they became living archives of how political fear worked. Their public image grew alongside the tower's reputation. The nickname, Beefeaters, carried a sense of tradition and legend, making them instantly recognisable as part of England's ceremonial identity. Uniform, ceremony, and the famous nightly locking of the gates turned everyday security into ritual. That ritual did something important. It reassured the public that the Crown's most sensitive place, its prison, its storehouse, its symbolic heart, was still guarded by rules older than any one crisis. Even when plots rocked the state, the ceremony suggested continuity. Spies and conspirators depended on ambiguity, but the tower depended on clarity. Gates closed, names recorded, movements watched, narratives controlled. The yeoman warders embodied that clarity. They were both watchers and symbols, both keepers of keys and keepers of the story the fortress told. In a world where treason could begin as a single message, passed hand to hand, the state answered with stone walls, iron discipline, and guardians whose presence announced that secrets had limits. Ravens did not arrive at the Tower of London as decorative creatures or tourist curiosities. They belonged to a medieval mental world in which animals were read as signs, warnings, and omens. Black-feathered, intelligent, and associated with battlefields and corpses, ravens carried meanings that were both ancient and flexible. Their presence around a fortress already heavy with bloodshed and imprisonment encouraged stories that blended observation with belief. Over time, these stories hardened into superstition, linking the birds directly to the survival of crown and kingdom. The idea that the monarchy would fall if the ravens ever left the tower reflects how deeply symbolism mattered to royal authority. Power did not rest on force alone, it also relied on the appearance of cosmic order. By allowing the superstition to persist, the crown benefited from it. The ravens became living symbols of continuity, suggesting that the monarchy was anchored not just in law and stone, but in fate itself. What mattered was not whether the legend was true, but that it was believed. Care for the ravens eventually became formalized, transforming superstition into managed tradition. Dedicated keepers, controlled feeding, clipped wings, and ritualized explanations turned wild birds into semi-official residents. This act of control was itself symbolic. Even superstition was absorbed into state order. The monarchy did not deny the legend, it domesticated it. In doing so, fear was reshaped into reassurance and unpredictability into ritual. This shift mirrors the broader transformation of the tower itself. For centuries, the fortress functioned as a place where terror was real and immediate. Imprisonment, execution, and surveillance defined its meaning for Londoners. The tower was not a monument to be admired, but a mechanism of power to be feared. Its walls represented the state's ability to punish, isolate, and destroy those who crossed invisible political lines. As the nature of authority changed, the tower's function began to change with it. Public execution ceased, political imprisonment declined, and the fortress lost its role as an active instrument of terror. Yet its symbolic weight did not disappear. Instead, it was reinterpreted. What had once inspired fear was now framed as history. Violence became narrative. Suffering became memory. The tower was not softened, it was contextualized. The ravens played a crucial role in this reinterpretation. They offered a story that was dark but safe, ominous but controlled. Visitors could engage with fear at a distance, through legend rather than lived experience. The birds connected the modern viewer to a medieval mindset, without forcing them to confront medieval brutality directly. Superstition became a bridge between past anxiety and present curiosity. Ceremony reinforced this transformation. The tower's routines, guards, keys, and rituals continued, but their meaning shifted. What once enforced obedience now performed heritage. The same walls that had confined prisoners now guided visitors. The fortress remained unchanged in stone, yet radically altered in function. Fear was no longer imposed, it was remembered. Authority was no longer enforced, it was displayed. The tower's evolution into a national symbol did not erase its darker past. Instead, it integrated it. Ravens still stalk the grounds, executions are still recalled, and imprisonment is still narrated. But these elements now serve a different purpose. They construct a shared historical identity, one that acknowledges cruelty without reproducing it. The tower stands as proof that power can outlive its methods, and that fear, once central to authority, can be transformed into story, symbol, and controlled memory.